Amanda, how are you?
So
just check in with Storm.
The OT clan, come on in. We need you. Hey, yeah, all right. Let's see. I'm all wired up. This is a bit. Hey, yeah. The chicken is out.
Okay, everybody. Good morning. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present and future of the land we're having this meeting on. And I extend that thanks and acknowledgement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people attending this forum. I'm James Mort, and on behalf of my fellow director, Sarah, I welcome you to the MiHAVEN Care SDA Forum. Together with our special guest, speaker, Anneke from Disability Specialists. So, I'm now going to hand over to Sarah and Anneke to take you through this session and what will be a very interesting and intriguing session on what is, I believe, a very interesting, confusing, frustrating realm of life. So, welcome and good luck, you two.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Morning, Anneke.
Good morning.
So we're sort of the bookends of today. I'll take sort of the lead facilitating role, and Anneke's going to fill in all the more technical parts of, from an OT perspective. The journey's been a really interesting, as James says, challenging. I call the NDAS like learning Latin. It's such a complex sort of language, but the more time you spend, the more you immerse yourselves, the more you sort of get to understand, and it all starts to make sense. So, as we know, this has been the biggest social revolution ever in history. And that's a great thing. And as a community in Cairns, we've got a wonderful opportunity to do some really special things for people's lives and changing those lives. And from MiHAVEN's perspective, we are a social enterprise, B Corp registered globally, which means we're a business for purpose, for social good. So we really, with purpose, think about why we do things. And James and I have been building and developing for over 35 years collectively. And what happened to me was I was called by ARC. Natasha rang me about a year ago in July and said, would I attend one of the first disability network forums? And I said, sure. Why? And she said, we need somebody to start thinking about SDA housing for the community. So I went in there quite naively, but I do like challenges and I do like doing things which, puts us into purpose and collaborating with communities. And we'd recently just done something similar for access housing for women with domestic violence. So we actually raised a couple $1 million out of the government to do that, and that was the first in Cairns, maybe the first in Australia at the time. So it seemed to be a good fit for us. From that group, some people put their hands up and said, let's set up our own little SDA forum. Let's work out how we can set a goal to get the first SDA house built. Lynn rang me one day down at Mission Beach and said, hi, I'm Lynn. Sarah, help. My daughter needs a home. So I said to her, all right, let's make October 2020 as the target. I didn't know at the time that actually James and I would be the two people building that house for your daughter, but it's been such a pleasure and such an honour to do. So I just wanted to, we talked about a year ago the need to share what we know, because I know a little bit, you guys know bits and pieces, and if we can put the puzzle together, we can help each other through the journey of those who would be eligible to get the SDA. So that's just a little bit about who we are. Anneke, tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Anneke from Disability Specialists. I've been a community occupational therapist for the last 15 years in the community. I've got a special interest in disability accommodation. My background is in law and mining, so I like to combine law, mining and health together for housing.
Which is a great combination of skills. I said to Anneke, what made you go into mining? Where's the relevance there? So tell me about that.
The adventure, of course, but also the design. When you walk into a mine, from the control room to the maintenance shed to the underground, there's elements of design everywhere, particularly ergonomics in the control room, layout and design in maintenance rooms to ensure that we reduce injury, and underground, all the things that are in housing as well, your lighting,
all those things that make you safe or unsafe. Yeah, cool. So a little bit about today. This is certainly not the order of the slides, but interestingly, we both went away and sort of did our own presentation. Then we spent all of Thursday night last week smashing each other's slides to pieces, going, I think we need to say this first and then we'll bring that in. So it's a bit of an evolution as to how we'll talk through the key points. So some of the highlights will be, why is SDA needed in Cairns? From Anneke's point, from the OT point, the care and duty, negligence and scope of practice. What is an OT? What do they do? Why are they so important in this process of facilitating people into their housing plan, into their SDA home? The background to functional assessments, the language, SIL, ILO, SDA, what do they mean, the context of that. How do I access SDA? That's one of the key things we're going to try and break down today, so people understand just the process to go through. And then finally, I suppose James and I will sort of take and explain, the SDA design process and all the things going on in the construction industry, which makes the houses really safe and robust, and there's a lot of changes going in that. So that's sort of the overview. We felt it was really important to bring back to the heart of the purpose of NDIS, which I know all of you would understand and believe in, but it really is this freedom of choice, transparency, trust, the opportunity of finally having independent living, but understanding what does independent living mean in the context of NDIS, and preserving people's rights and privacy and taking them through the journey. Is there anything you want to add to that slide at all?
And they're the core factors of a good functional for SDA,
Yep, okay, cool. So the little breakdowns of what is SIL, what is ILO, and what does SDA mean. We won't obviously go into lots of conversations about the different options in housing today, because we could get bogged down for a few hours trying to explain. and there's a lot of things, there's a lot of changes going on recently, especially with the ILO. So I'm sure some of you have been attending different webinars around Australia where lots of other OTs and NDA specialists are trying to explain how that works. But in these boxes, we've got the supported independent living. Anneke, do you want to go and explain a bit more about that? Most of you probably know about the SIL.
You did that part yesterday.
Did I? Oh, did I? This is my part.
Okay, where do we start? Supported independent living, similar to the old block funding like you used to have, but now obviously we need a good coordinator. There's lots of lovely coordinators in the room, I see, to get that person into SILs in the first place. But you can explain that part.
Yeah, I mean the SIL then comes back into the SDA as
Yeah,
well, but
yeah.
there's also the other models at the moment where there is currently SIL for clients who may not, they would have SDA at that time as well, wouldn't they?
Not always.
Not always, yes.
Usually they've got SIL before they have SDA.
Exactly,
Yeah,
yeah, okay. The individual living options, I don't know if many of you have been listening to that. That really, I think, evolved in June, July this year. And that's where people can actually independently sort of register to accommodate somebody with a disability in their own home. And then there's a whole program and sets of procedures and regulations that relates to that, but that's very new.
There's 4 areas of that you can apply for, but with each area there comes a lot of risk as well. Because it's within a home.
You're living in someone else's home. You're basically living in someone else's home who has to get themselves registered to be able to take you as their tenant. Core funding, home modification. So obviously people have the choice, you know, if they've had a change of circumstance and they want to go back to their home, they can apply through their support coordinator and their OT to look at doing an extensive home modification. That has lots of challenges in itself. You know, if you look at a lot of properties, on a practical point of view, if you look at properties in Cairns, which are very much high set because of the flood issues up here and the old Queenslanders, you might turn around and look at that house and say, well, is it really going to be an appropriate house to actually do a home modification to? And the cost of actually making that compliant. Whereas sort of in a more traditional sort of city context in the outer suburbs where the land is flat and it's not subject to, you know, flooding, you'll probably find it an easier thing to do. But then, as James would say, if it's a block construction, the cost of knocking out walls and structural walls to make those door openings wider and functional can be incredibly expensive. So you could be looking up to $200,000 to renovate maybe a house here that's worth $300,000 or $400,000 to make it functional. So I think there will be quite a lot of challenges in justifying it with the scheme as to the, because it's a real test about value for money at the same time as to how you expend that money. And we're also finding with a number of clients we're meeting recently where they think they'd like to go into a home modification and go back to the family, but if we gave them the other option of having a brand new SDA home which has got purpose-built, everything you need, it may be actually a better option, a better outcome.
Yeah, home modifications are a bit hit and miss. As an OT that's done over 200 in the community, OT is a very glamorous job, sitting beside toilets measuring up, as we know. We have some OTs in the audience. So yeah, it's very 50-50 with respect to the approvals.
Yep. So following on to that, so I sort of said to Anneke, before we go into a lot of the OT nitty-gritty and functional assessments, I felt that from all the conversations I've been having with support coordinators for the last 12 months, the core sort of test is the eligibility for the SDA. So just as we know that there's now, let me get the numbers, over 3,000 people I believe have now got an NDA plan in Cairns. 6 months ago that was about 2,200 and they're saying that they're expecting that to increase by another 400 to 500. So by next year we're probably looking at about 3,500 people who have got have got NDAS plans approved. As you know, with those plans, they are constantly reviewed and there's change of circumstances. But just because you have an NDIS plan doesn't necessarily mean you will step straight into being eligible to have what we call SDA housing. So there are two key core tests in assessing your if you are going to be eligible to actually consider wanting to have the housing. So you could say, I want the aspiration of moving away from home. I want to leave my parents and I actually want to go and live independently. And that's very much within the goal setting that we know that you have in the plans. But unfortunately, it may not actually match to what the NDIS is expecting as to, on that journey as to what that physical requirement is, as to then assessing that person saying, yeah, for all these other reasons, apart from the aspiration of wanting your own home and living independently, does it also fall into these two key tests? So the two key tests are extreme functional impairment and having very high support needs. The other, and we'll go through and I'll get Anneke to talk about, what does that mean about extreme functional impairment or very high support needs. But in addition to that, and I know that some people here from Department of Housing, you also have to, as support coordinators, you need to go and test the market to say, are there acceptable mainstream housing options in our community first up? And the panel will expect you to have that evidence and assess that to see if that's a reality or not. So that's also a very key thing to be looking at. We know in Cairns, we do have a housing crisis. Just mainstream housing before COVID hit, we had 1% vacancy rate in the rental market. And James and I have done a lot of sort of community work with Access. We know that there's over 2,000 people homeless in Cairns, and that is growing at least 20% per annum. And just with COVID and construction, we haven't seen very much sort of medium and high density accommodation built here in the last 10 years, pretty much since the GFC. So we do have a housing shortage here. So that's a really important thing to just be aware of, that availability and supply is quite short in the Cairns market, in mainstream.
These two eligibility are taken directly from the new 2020 rules. Back one.
Do you want me to go back?
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, they're a lot easier to read these days than anyone that's read the old 2016 rules. It's a lot more user-friendly and easier to interpret for when you're doing your SDA plans.
Next one. Me? Okay. So what's extreme functional impairment? The participant's impairment results in an extremely reduced functional capacity of the participant to undertake one or more of the activities of mobility, self-care or self-management. The participants have a very high need for person-to-person supports in undertaking any activity, even with assistive technology, equipment or home modifications. So some examples are just simply getting in and out of bed, from bed to going to the bathroom, getting dressed, just moving around the house, moving around just, in normal life. The inability to be able to prepare meals independently, and just accessing the community independently. So that's in a general sort of sum, but I'm sure, Anneke, as an OT, you'd see all sorts of different types of disability, and some people have a whole multitude of different issues as to what would be affecting their functional impairment.
And probably the best example of this would be where we are right now, your spinal injuries and your double amputees, that despite a good environment, good equipment, good design, good support workers, they still need a lot of one-on-one support.
And the other key for us, especially from the design point of view, is we would pretty much identify most people falling into the extreme functional impairment would require a hoist. So they're not able to get from the bed to the bathroom or just get themselves from their chair into their bed. So very important for us from a design point of view as to how we design the houses. The other category here is, what are very high support needs. So that being the second category of what NDIS looks as a key eligibility requirement. Do you want to discuss this one?
It's very open to interpretation, this one, depending on the condition, and it is case by case specific. Who meets this? Yeah.
But it would, okay, so some examples I've seen, just because from going through the assessments, is There would be people who have been living with their parents for a long time, and their parents have got to a certain age where they no longer can assist them. They may have been, brothers and sisters also when they were young growing up, and then they've moved on, left home, got married, left Cairns, whatever. So you've got a situation with the one child still at home with the ageing parents, and then there can be circumstances that can change very dramatically with the onset of dementia or whatever to the parents, where suddenly that daughter or son is not able to be looked after, and therefore we've really got to think about an appropriate place for them to go. And as we know, one of the key places we don't want anyone to go is into respite or aged care. And up until we had the NDIS scheme and the ability to get SDA funding, they were really the only choices for a lot of people to go to. So that's one of the key objectives is getting people out of aged care at the moment. We have a number of people who are currently in aged care who are eligible for SDA funding, and we are building for them. They also could be in the old group home situation, as I said before, the residential aged care, and they've been in those situations for so long that they've lost the ability to even know how to get back into normal functional living. And as we know, a number of clients with COVID have been in aged care for a long time this year where they didn't get any interaction with their family or their support carers because of all the restrictions, and their health deteriorated and they weren't getting the same exercise and the same support. So we've seen a critical need to really facilitate and fast track a lot of those people's SDA plans to get them into the housing. So Anneke, this one is yours. I mean, I can talk about why SDA is needed in Cairns just from an NDIS perspective. So statistically, the data that's often referenced is we're saying of all the people with an NDIS plan across Australia, approximately 6% of everybody with NDIS would actually probably appear to fit the eligibility to be approved for SDA. So it's a small number. So in Cairns, we're looking at 3,000 people with NDIS plans currently. I would estimate that we're probably looking at no more than maybe 200 people in the community that would fall into the category of having the ability to get SDA funding. But you know more than I do about behind the scenes before the NDIS was rolled out and what was happening in the housing.
So that was called the local home truths for a reason. I'm making it quite specific to Cairns for today. Cairns has been in an accommodation crisis ever since I was a new graduate. I'm now a vintage OT, so that was a very long time ago. And what's happened is, like Sarah said, everyone was either going into aged care or out to Gordonvale. However, I know that many coordinators also here today, like myself, have taken their participants to accident and emergency due to neglect or in order to rehouse them, and that's when you get the term bed block. For those of you that aren't health, bed block is someone that's in hospital, and there are a lot of people that have been in hospital for a year and there's nowhere for them to go until a plan is worked out in the community. And sadly, thanks to MiHAVEN, that's why we're here today, because we now have those options, whereas before it was just nursing home.
Yeah, or going back to hospital.
Yeah.
And part of the networking groups that we've been working with, we've got a small cluster now working with the hospital with the discharge and with the vet, the OT, which some of you would know well. And as we know, at any day of the week, there'd be up to 10 people who've been in Cairns-based hospital for over 2 years, waiting for somewhere to go. And that is costing us as a community about $1,200 a day for those beds. And last week, the hospital was at 120% capacity. So we have, there's a crisis just in the system of getting people out, and ideally working really at that early stage of finding the people to design the houses appropriately and also finding them the right housemate and flatmates they want to live with. So back to you.
Cool. Can we just go back to the last one for a minute?
Oh yeah, go.
This is why design, environment, equipment and training is required. As OTs, it feels like we've been in a lot of Sil's home, so we see the good and the bad and the ugly around town. And these are just some examples of when things do go wrong. So we call this a sharing injury where someone's skin is rubbing against a wheelchair and needs to be picked up during, say, your shower inspections, or sometimes we do positioning and seating plans in homes, and this is an example when it hasn't been followed and caused injury to the client.
Yeah, and as we were talking about yesterday, there's quite a few people at the moment that are probably in still accommodation, but that accommodation is not designed to any standard.
Yeah.
So the door opening into the bathroom is just standard narrow door opening. The bathroom's completely inappropriately designed. It's, you know, got the glass shower screen. It's a very unsafe environment, and in those situations, people are going to be prone to accidents and have, you know, a further risk of being in a worse situation. Yeah.
And I just want to raise some healthcare ethics 101 in the community, just because we're all working together and we all share information. Basic run through, what is consent? We all pull out that little bit of paper and get everyone to sign it because we have to. What is that though? Do we know what express consent is, implied consent? Do we know, is it in writing? For coordinators, you need to know all the types of consent because I'll provide an example. I had a coordinator who had a participant with an intellectual disability sign the consent form, and the person said, well, that's okay by the NDIS, but when my auditor come along, they said, well, why did you get someone with an intellectual disability who doesn't understand your service agreement sign the consent form? That's not legal. So it's taken very seriously in the health field, especially if you work with the public guardian. They take it very seriously, as do we. So just a little reminder. Also, privacy and confidentiality. See a lot of emails pop around that have the client name in the subject heading. No go. Just a kind courtesy reminder. Can we de-identify it, put their NDIS number, or refer to the body of text. And intellectual property, an example the other week, I was typing my own functional report, and from the medical documentation I had, I noticed that another clinician was using my template, which is not on. So intellectual property is all your marketing and your logos, everything associated to your business. So you know, we chop and change jobs here in Cairns, so people, I do see people still sticking things on USB sticks. No. So just a general reminder of healthcare ethics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good point. This is another one for Anneke. Just, you know, what is an occupational therapist? And it's quite interesting to hear the background and history of how this particular expertise has evolved over time.
True.
Yeah.
I do have my fellow clinicians in the audience who will be making sure I get this right. You're welcome to speak up if you like. So by definition, these are the two definitions which you can read on screen. These are the 8 focus areas that you'll probably see within the functional reports that we write. But OT, why are we even here? What's an OT? Okay, to give you some background in a nutshell as to why we work in so many areas. Back in the 18th century, we had a guy called George Barden who was an architect, and he was injured and he was assisted by OTs in order to get better. Moving into the 19th century, we had world wars where all the soldiers were coming back from war. They were lying around with nothing to do, so occupational therapists assisted them with their rehabilitation. So that was the rehabilitation movement. Then moving on to today, that's why we've delved into so many areas. You'll see OTs working in rehab, lymphedema, oncology, hands, burns, till today.
And what I find interesting about it too is the origin of that story, being an architect, is it's the spatial relationship too to the healing process. And it's when Anneke met with James and I, and with Lynn and Bill, when we first started designing the first SDA houses, is a huge awareness of just understanding that everything you place in that house, the impact it's going to have on that particular person's, disability, and thinking really clearly through that whole design process. So there is a massive co-design. I mean, we're very into this, the co-design, the relationship with the family who's going to be moving to this house, really understanding how that works, and you know, the talents of Anneke with the OT side of it has really sort of opened so many new ideas to us into a very intricate sort of detailed design requirement to make sure these houses are really going to be of the highest and best purpose. So.
And the difference again between physio and OT, the million-dollar question. Physios deal mainly, they are masters of muscles, they are absolutely brilliant at what they do. OTs, we do muscles, bones, but we also do psychology and neuroscience, so that's why you see us doing a lot of the mental health stuff. That goes back to the way George Barton in the 1800s or the 18th century, where they had people chained to walls as therapy. He was the guy that said, hey, let's not chain people to walls because it's not good for their mental health. And here we are today, and so we do a bit of both, physical and cognitive, yeah.
So this also just is an overview, and you could probably say that a lot of that was spelled out in that last slide, but that's also just showing the 8 core areas that the OTs are trained in.
And what is the functional assessment? The million-dollar question. So as coordinators, you'll call up all your OTs, they say, hey, I do this, I don't do this, and that all comes down to training. Where you were trained, where I was trained, it had a heavy focus on neuroscience, and also we had a housing component where you had to design a disability house to building standard, and you weren't allowed your OT degree until you had done that. So I guess that's a little bit of where my training and background comes from. And it depends what outcome you're seeking. Are you seeking a functional for a review? Are you going for an appeal? Do you want it for SILS? Are you wanting an SDA application? Make that known to your therapist, because we write according to that.
Covered? Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Nutshell. So, why am I here today as an OT and SDA? Again, I'd like to point out this picture.
It's not a MiHAVEN home, firstly. Just want to say.
And someone in the audience already knows this answer, so you're not allowed to answer this one. What's wrong with this disability home? This was approved in New South Wales, in Corlett, a place called Corlett.
Steps.
Yeah, yeah. And Sarah pointed out yesterday, oh, surely there's a ramp up there, but no. The person has to go to the back door to enter their own home, which isn't very user-friendly, isn't it? Yeah.
So if we were building that, given that there must have been a flooding issue as to why that house is raised, James would have raised the land right up so it was all level, so you'd be walking in without any steps. Another one?
This is actually a local design. I'm not going to say whose it is, but I was asked to come along and do the inspection after it was built, not before or prior. And what's wrong with this one?
The entranceway.
And what's specific?
There's no pathway to the entranceway, and the doors don't look like they're wheelchair friendly.
So we've got our wheelchair coming onto grass and going through grass to get in the door. Yeah. Yeah.
You can climb in the window, yeah. And especially when it rains a little bit up here. Can you imagine how boggy that grass would be in your wheelchair? Anyway, yeah.
That's a good OT practical answer, Deborah, thank you.
And do you want to also just note about the other thing, but internally?
Internally, obviously the bathroom wasn't disability friendly, it wasn't built to disability standard, and we had TVs affixed 3/4 of the way up the wall, so when someone was, if they got through the grass in their wheelchair, they'll be sitting in their lounge looking up at a screen. But not everyone has tilt on their wheelchairs, so yeah. Sitting in your wheelchair looking up like that, causing contractures, yeah.
Yeah, not good, not a great outcome. So this is getting into sort of more the detailed design side and the building side, plus with also the OT. So I don't know how many of you are all aware of this, but there's pretty much 4 main categories as to what we see an SDA design or an SDA category that would come into someone's plan. I think before we even say that though, when you are doing, if someone identifies in those first two categories we talked about earlier this morning, and then the support coordinator, which will then be engaged to say, okay, this has been identified that, you know, that the client wants to have the aspiration living in their own home. In your role, as you say, this is you'd be asked to do a different type of assessment because you're looking at the functional assessment as to what category of housing is going to be appropriate for that person. Correct? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So at the highest end, we have high physical support. High physical support really goes back to that first category of what we described of a person being in, you know, the limitations of their ability, their need to have pretty much 24/7 care with the SIL provider. I think one of the key elements we will always see as the builder and from the OT is that person will require a hoist. From a building perspective, that's the highest level of building for us. So internally, James will make sure that in every bedroom that there are steel frames, structural support systems put in, so we can have the flexibility of working out what particular hoist system or what that looks like. That would be the key thing. The other key part of it too is from a building code classification, we will be building to a class 1B or a class 3. A class 3 is almost to a commercial standard, which means you'll have fire sprinklers in the house, which you don't have. All you normally have in a normal home is the smoke alarm, whereas the fire sprinklers is a significant cost to the build. It's about $60,000 in the build. Not only that, there's about $10,000 per annum just in the servicing and maintenance of having fire sprinklers into the house. So they are the key, because from a fire perspective, you've got to be able to ensure that that person has got, James, you know more about this than I do, from a fire perspective, they've got X amount of time to be able to get out of the house. Yep. Then the next category down is what we call fully accessible. We would pretty much design to the same standard with fire sprinklers. I mean, we are going to do this anyway as a standard for us. We want our houses to be to the highest standard to allow the greatest flexibility of the participants we can accommodate in the future. But the key difference probably would be is they still have their fully accessible bathroom, all to the SDA design standards and also to the Australian standards, but they won't require a hoist. Be the key thing for us. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd see different in the assessment. Pretty much the same. Good. Yep. Then, as it says up here, it's housing designed to improve livability by incorporating a reasonable level of physical access and enhanced provision for people with intellectual or cognitive impairment. So we would probably see a number of clients who may have a combination of maybe autism with blindness, a sensory issue. We don't have to design those with the fire sprinklers, so it's a lower building requirement for us from a building code perspective. But we would still be very aware of making sure the surfaces are flat, that access is easy, there's no trip hazards. Yeah, so you physically wouldn't see that much difference when you're walking through our houses, but internally there'd be quite a lot of different design requirements that we don't need to be so stringent on. The next category is robust. So do you want to talk a little bit about robust for me?
Robust is a very specialised build. It requires high impact wall lining, soundproofing, laminated glass, and usually you're looking at your restricted practice clients. Not everyone falls under a restricted practice document. They are lengthy, as we know, and difficult to implement and really highly legislated, but they can also fall under cognitive behavioural therapies. So your ones with really challenging behaviours fit into the robust.
So currently in our pipeline, because we only just started back in July this year to actually start building, we haven't yet got robust under construction, but we're identifying with a number of support coordinators and OTs that there is very much high demand for that style of housing. But we will really want to do a lot of co-design with the support coordinators and the OTs to be a bit innovative into what that housing solution could look like. Yeah.
And basic?
So there's another category if you look up the SDA guidelines, which is basic, but it really doesn't really mean very much. That would be just a standard home, and when you talk within the webinars and the specialists, they're saying that category is almost sort of disappearing off the system. part of all of this for us too, from a building point of view, is there's obviously categories as to acknowledgement of location factor. So Cairns will have a location loading of 1.2. It will also have if you're going to put the fire sprinklers in, we also get a loading for that. So it's acknowledgement about the extra cost to maintain those houses from the maintenance point of view. And then in each one of those categories, as you will see, the OT will see, and in that person's plan, it will then identify what category, but also it will identify the ratio of the housing. So there are, in the SDA guidelines, there's apartments, villa duplexes, houses, and that covers everything. Obviously in Cairns, James and I don't really feel like the apartment market's really the appropriate style of housing. You know, you have to have a lot of volume, and then you'd have to blend that volume with standard housing. We're really conservatively looking at what we believe is the more stylistic of housing we think is appropriate, which is your low density, single story, and you know, be mindful that the NDIS is an insurance scheme and money will be limited as we go. So we would probably typically see what we call a 3-to-1 or a 2-to-1 in our house design layout. So the 3-to-1 means that the extra room, the fourth room, is for the SIL provider. And the 2-to-1 also means that the extra room, the third bedroom, will be the dedicated facility, being the working office with a bathroom for the SIL provider. There'll be questions. We'll take questions once we get through all the slides. So I think that covered most things. Okay, so how do we access SDA? Anneke?
Oh, the $1 million question,
Yeah.
hey? Obviously, we need some money in our plan in order to create a housing plan. There are quite savvy coordinators here in Cairns that I know are doing this, and the coordinator will then, if there is money in the plan budget, they'll liaise with an OT and get a good functional. Sarah?
Yeah. So this is where the block wall could be at times, trying to get through this. I've listened to a million different webinars from all sorts of housing specialists in Sydney, Melbourne. As we know, Cairns was like one of the last places to roll out, only 18 months ago. Melbourne, Geelong being the birthplace of where the NDIS is positioned. James and I have spent a lot of time connecting back to that network. We've got a lot of family also involved doing it down in Melbourne. And it's been a bit of an evolution up here, but I think the good thing about being the last to roll out is we can learn mistakes and learn from, from what other developers and other support coordinators and OTs have experienced as to the challenges. The key, there's a lot of documents which we can share with you, and we'll have a slide giving you the links to it. And this is free information. Summer Foundation, which a lot of you will know about down in Melbourne, is one of the leading sort of advocates in the NDIS world. And they had some very helpful booklets which explain step by step in very plain English as to how do you write a housing plan, how do you do this, how do you do that. They use case notes from OTs.
Looking for cash and wanted contracts in place right from the start, and you guys aren't like that, so it's a pleasure to work with you. Yeah.
Thanks, Anneke. Okay. Any questions at all that anyone wants to ask? Anything? Anyone? Yes, go, Nicole.
I'm just wondering, what's an approximate time frame from the time that a participant might get the okay to have SDA put into their plan, and you being able to then purpose build for them to move in? So if I'm understanding right, some of them that you're building to purpose for clients that have already got SD in their pack. So what's that?
So I'd say
Time frame?
the maximum would be like, say, 12 months. I mean, Lily Street, we started building in July. We built that so quickly. And we were lucky because it was a dry season, and James has got 20 guys who are quite specialists, and they actually love, the building team actually is really enjoying doing this because there is so much intricacy in every detail, like just getting the widths right. Like you would fail over 5 mil in an SDA house. 1 mil, you will fail. So we're very mindful about that. That's a huge risk for us to get that wrong. But from so I'd say at the moment, we've got capacity to take people straight away. The Severin Street houses will be finished in probably March, April. So I really encourage anybody that wants to speak to us afterwards. We've got a number of participants who have identified. Some of them are currently in accommodation that it's just not appropriate anymore, and the family just is desperate to get them out. A lot of families don't realise that it's available and that they can access it, and all they have to do is have a change of circumstance in their plan. So it's really about how quickly that support coordinator with the OT can get in and make that modification. It does help. So a year ago, you couldn't even say in the plan, so-and-so is going to this house, because that house didn't exist. No one could be identified. So I do know that the panel will probably tick another box by saying, oh, so-and-so has been identified to a MiHAVEN care home in Cairns North or whatever. And so then they know that if the plan gets approved, that they will be able to be moving into that house, rather than just having it approved in their plan and it could be sitting there for 2 years dormant, plan's not being accessed. So ideally what we want to do is have a pipeline of at least 10 people chugging along somewhere along the journey of either having an SDA plan or being clearly identified that they should get an SDA plan. As we know, there's been a backlog to get all the reports done. So Anneke, you might say, look, 2 or 3 months just to get an OT booked in to get that plan going, depending on demand. And there's only a few handful of people that are really specialised in knowing how to do the functional assessments. And then as a support coordinator, you put it into the system, and it's how much you just keep barking and ringing and, hello, it's me again, blah, 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 and just hopefully seeing that through. But I have seen, surprisingly, one client, we thought we had to do a full update of something, and then we got the call literally the next morning and the plan had been approved, because they're in aged care and their health was really deteriorating. We didn't get them out quickly because they just weren't getting any exercise, nutrition, whatever, wasn't great. So yeah, so I think even I just in the last 2 days been really surprised. I've had a couple of calls from the NDIA saying we're fast tracking your SDA because we understand that this is the first house to be produced in Cairns, and it just wouldn't be right for us to be waiting 6 months to do that. Yeah. Any questions?
So you always retain ownership of the home per se, and they just have through their plan with the SDA?
So our model at the moment is we're setting up a fund with a social impact fund in Sydney with investors who have probably got about $60 million committed to building SDA housing in Australia. And so they've allocated X amount to work with our company. And we will be their representatives here for the property. So we did the same with the student accommodation. We got 2 social impact funds and we established the student accommodation with their support financially. They will hold that for, as part of their portfolio, and then we will perform as the property manager and the builder through that relationship. Yeah, yeah.
And then if somebody goes into a 2-bedroom, I understand you're working with Sills and you're trying to match, etc. But just wondering about the autonomy of that one person, one resident, and how much say they have with regards to their flat management. If they, depending on their funding, how their funding might change. Does that relate to whether they're in a 1-bedroom or a 3-bedroom?
So you could have funding, so you could have a situation where someone might have funding for 2-to-1, which is much higher than a 3-to-1. But I might turn around and say, look, we've only got the 3-to-1 house at the moment. Would that be a major issue for you to want to live with a third person rather than 2 people? So it's a matter of choice and a matter of demand and supply as well. So they may say, no, look, that's fine, because then out of the plan, we'll only get paid what a 3-to-1 would be anyway. So the NDAS wouldn't block that. Or you could have a change of circumstance where you may only have a 3-to-1 in your plan, but you could prove a change of circumstance to want to only live in a 2-to-1. And you'd have to go back with your support coordinator. And I mean, we know it's not an easy journey to get those justifications and changes through, but that's where I go back to saying quality of evidence, having a really strong report to explain. Yeah. But, we're currently running 135 beds student accommodation in 18 apartments. Every day of the week we've got to match 7 people to live together for up to a year. Uni students or itinerant workers coming in, and sure there's some issues, but then we've just got to work it through as to how we get on and respect and collaborate and as I say, who stole my peanut butter? So, you know, that, and also from a property management point of view, to be an SDA property manager is far more demanding than just a property manager. You're not just looking at space or cleanliness, you're looking at, you know, there's a requirement for us to be working back with the SIL and the participants every, I don't know, was it, Stacey, every month or, quarterly. So we have to sit together and all go through and say how are we all getting on. Are there any issues? You know, you might say I can't stand such and such dog, it barks all night, I can't sleep. So you go, okay, we've got to work that out. Yeah.
So if someone decides they want to exit your SDA, they're in an RTA agreement, but how does that work with their SDA funding?
They won't lose it. So as you know, your SDA funding is for life. It's legislated. So so you have that. So under you would just go through the normal process of an RTA lease of saying I want to break my lease. So we would find most people at the moment want to take a long lease because we're really building it as their home. So they might want a 5-year or a 10-year, but they know that if it doesn't work for them, that they have the right, like you and I would have under the RTA agreement, to be able to get out. But it's a hybrid model because also the SIL and the role of the SIL is very important to that because they're the key person in that house day in, day out. So, you know, we will be really relying on our relationship with the SIL, like through a collaboration agreement, to make sure that everything's been maintained, that the house is clean, that everyone's happy, just happy homes. Yeah, so it's very people management focused.
So your Severn Street property is 2 3-beds plus a carer. Is it one carer in each section or one carer in the middle and two?
No, you could have one carer in the middle in a different model. So like with the robust model, you could actually have, say, maybe a carer that's servicing, because in the robust you might want people, they really want to live on their own, like they don't want to be sharing. So there would be different models for that. But in the high physical support need,
So in the Severn Street specific one,
yeah,
it's 3 plus 1. And
3 plus 1, yeah. And it could be a different SIL for that house to that house, but it would only be one SIL because they have to run the roster system. Brett, do you want to talk about that at all, being a SIL provider?
Yeah.
Well, just how, I mean, you know, you have to work with the participant in their plan. So say we had 3 people living in Severn Street and you were the SIL provider, then you would have to work with each one of those participants to create their own unique rostering system. Yeah? Yeah.
So I guess the connecting point is why a lot of people haven't moved to SDA at this point, that connection with how to people connect when you've got a person with disability over here in hospital who's had a severe injury, another person over here, there's no one way of connecting 2 people to say, would you like to meet to see whether you'd like to live together? So sports coordinators are really critical in that role, but then you only have certain customers that you're working with, so that's the first bit. It's a bit of a hurdle. Once you've connected, then say 2 individuals who want to share together, then you're working individually on designing a roster that meets their needs. So you're actually submitting a roster of the SIL quote as based on what does each individual need throughout 24 hours of the day. There might be times in the home where they might be having dinner together and the staffing might be combined, but then there might be times where they want to go out, one resident wants to go out to their art class, or they want to go out and hang out with friends at the theatre on Friday night. So then you have one-to-one supports for that individual, and then you've got the community access component, the CP, community participation, where each individual can then choose other providers. So that's when they can say, look, I want to attend day services, or I want to go and participate in another program. So I'm going to put that into the SIL quote, but I'll purchase supports from another provider during those times. So that's where the SIL is one provider for the household, but the CP hours are totally individualised.
Yeah. So a lot of clients have sort of said, oh, I don't want to lose my support carer, she's been with me for 5 years. So that won't happen. That person will still be that person during the day to take them out, go to the hairdresser or go shopping or whatever it is, yeah. But it's really that 24/7 in the house situation of
so
making...
going off that again then, because there's 2 two SIL providers?
Yes, yeah.
Because it's got two carers.
Yeah, yeah, because it comes down to this whole matching situation, and then those three participants with their support coordinators have to come to an agreement as to we're going to be happy with that SIL provider. And then that gets put into their plan, and obviously there's all review processes and all the checks and balances that happen there. Yeah, and then we would have a collaboration agreement with that SIL provider as well, because as the representative of the owners of the house, we have to make sure that everything's been properly maintained, safe, you know, if there's any issues, anything that's affecting people living there. Yeah.
We've got two support service providers. You can have 2, 3, 4 service providers in the same, the SIL is only the one.
Yes.
But you're coordinating supports during the day.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
8 to 10 hours a day. Totally separate from the SIL. That you self-manage as a participant yourself and have a separate 2 or 3 service providers go to work, doing other stuff, doing other community participation stuff. So the SIL is just the overriding supports that you share. The rest of it you can do it virtually. It's nothing like the old block funding. Absolutely nothing. Gone are those days, that means.
Right, okay, so that's a good thing.
For something that I am familiar with, like for example, Kutharinga on like Little Street when they have.
Oh, Catherine's from Kutharinga, yeah.
So how does this compare to Callahan Street where you've got sort of independent homes, there's SIL and they again have community support to go out, but the property's owned by Kutharinga and Kutharinga provide the carers at the
So
home.
I used to be MiHAVEN, this is a bit of coordination for. So it is that house in Callahan Street has a 2-bedroom with their own bathrooms and their own kitchen at the back. A carer's pod in the middle, and then the same at the front.
Yeah.
So it's basically 2 housemates at the back, 2 housemates at the front. But it is classed as a 4 to 1.
So you can do 4 to 1.
Yes,
You can
so
even
that
see
one-
6 to 1, but you wouldn't really, you wouldn't do it.
So there's
Yeah.
2 rooms at the back, 2 rooms at the front. So it is a 4-person SIL at that particular place. And then with that, so while we own the house and we do the rental for the house, if the 3 out of the 4 participants that live in that house decide they no longer want to be Kutharinga as their support provider in home, then we would no longer be the support provider for that home. So you have to have a majority rules of how many people who they want as the provider. So if 3 out of the 4 managers are currently saying no, we want to go with XYZ disability services, then XYZ disability services would put in their tender, they take it over, they and the owner says put in their
So is it still SDA?
That house is actually SDA registered, yes.
But and so it's owned by Kutharinga and they've got SDA in their plans as opposed to like the Green Sydney.
Some of them do have SDA. I don't believe all of them have SDA in there, but all of them are eligible. But it is an SDA eligible house.
So it's not a case that the investors are building homes and then participants are moving in. So the NDIS pay the investor a set amount each year based on their eligibility to then build that home and get that return for that
So
investment.
there's X amount of funding in certain participants' plans that they then pay to Kutharinga as the SDA registered house owner.
Which is separate.
Yeah. So we're sort of evolving, because Kutharinga originally got a
That was
grant
before,
from the Queensland Government before the NDAS came out. So they built pretty much the first model of that, and which helped acquire the land, and I know the build cost was really expensive at the time. And so we're an evolution from that, which is probably a more independent model, which is, we're not a not-for-profit, we're not associated with this. It would be really inappropriate for us to be a SIL as well as being the property owner for our model. We just want to be building it the best design to the highest standard architecturally, but then have really good property management systems, that everyone's happy, but then allowing the free market to, identify, who wants to live with who and, location and whatever, because that's going to be their home potentially for life. Yeah.
So the SDA application then essentially just gets a lump sum of money per year to pay to you,
Yes. So there's a drawdown out of their plan for it's rent basically. I use the word rent. They don't seem they call it income, whatever. But then there's also a So the rent, but it is quasi rent because it's coming straight out of their plan to pay for their accommodation.
The rental doesn't come out of your plan.
No, the rental
You
does.
pay rental.
Okay.
You
So
get
the
your
SDA,
SDA in your plan.
so for a high school support, it's about $33,000 a year. The investor will get to build that home, and they get that return each year. But your rent can only still be about 25% of your pension. And
Yeah.
then that is what your normal rent would be. And so the rent would go to you as well.
Yeah. So that 9,000.
Plus the rental,
Yeah.
rental assistance as well.
Okay.
But it is preferable under SDA now to have your SDA standalone builder, developer, whatever, and have your SIL as a totally separate company
Yes.
decided by the tenants.
Yeah. Not big orgs down in New South Wales have done huge big schemes out in the Hunter Valley, whatever, and they're doing everything. But I think here, more appropriate for everybody is to have that independence. Yeah, all of that. And the other thing, you might think, oh God, it's a lot of money, but then we have to keep a sinking fund to make sure that those properties are constantly maintained, upgraded for life. So what the government's done is taken themselves out of like a Department of Housing, social housing model where they've forever provided the housing, fixed whatever. I mean, I think it's innovative. It's pretty out there.
There's been no new housing built in years.
Mm.
And this
Yeah.
is the best initiative that SDA has got. But the SDA actually, the payment actually belongs to the participant. It's in their plan.
Okay.
And that could move with their plan. But it depends where they decide to put it. With the SDA
So if
developer.
they were to move out of this SDA into another SDA, the money just moves with them.
Well, we haven't done that yet. We haven't got a choice.
You haven't got there yet.
Please don't do that, Lynn. Yeah.
But yes, that's the whole thing in place. Because it's given the person the opportunity now.
Yeah.
And I mean, it still comes back to you could actually be your own SDA provider. If you're your own SDA provider and you've got your loan and everything else all sorted, but as the owner of the property, you don't even pay tax on that.
And I think that's probably what I
And
was
with the
thinking
family,
that people
the
own
family
the
one
house
is the new.
Yeah. So some people think, oh, I can get SDA, and so some people's partners think, oh, we'll go and get the SDA and we'll be a property developer and build it, and then we'll take that SDA component back. But it doesn't work. You won't get that. So because it's about creating. The intention, this is an insurance scheme, we know there's a limitation of money, it's got to be spent wisely, it's got to have value for money. We have to spend $10,000 just to be registered, we have to be audited every year as a provider, as we all do. So you want best practice, you want everything to be tested and transparent, and because you're looking after people's lives, you're going to make sure that they're, so it's... as Lynn said, it's very innovative, it's very exciting, very individual.
Very individual
Yeah.
to what it used to be.
And I think
And 1 to 3 is the maximum sort of under the price guide for SDA as far as what we get, what the builder can get back. 1 to 4 is a virtually group home now.
Yeah, it's too big.
1 to 5 is just for our home. 1 to 5 is ridiculous, it's way too big. Two of them lived in that for 18 years, it's a disaster.
I think
But 1 to 2, and the other issue is the other priority is when you're doing plans as support coordinator, you must get it right in your actual plan, how many residents that the person wants to share with. There's too many issues going through at the moment where you're having a lot of with the Summer Foundation, their apartments, they're 2 bedrooms, 1 resident. Well, if you've got been approved in your plan for 1 bedroom, 1 resident, high physical supports, developers won't look at you very kindly because they won't get they'll get more for that than what they will for the other way around. 2 bedrooms, 1 participant. It is very important that you have the correct participant number that you prefer to live with. We had an issue where our daughter was 1 to 3. And we went through a change of circumstances, because these houses are 1 to 2. Now, and she actually only wants to live 1 to 2. So we went through a change of circumstances, a big issue. We managed to get it back to 1 to 2, which is a higher percentage of return that the developer gets. But if you have the wrong number of participants in that plan, you can be tearing your hair out trying to.
So you're probably better trying to get a 2 to 1, and then you can have this free choice of saying, I'm happy to live with 3 to 1. But it's Lynn saying if you go 3 to 1, but you really can prove that for whatever, so we've got another client who's blind.
But the issue is when we put our change of circumstance in, and I still have not had it answered, is where does it state in the SDA rules legislation that NDIA has an obligation to determine how many people a person must live with? No one will answer that because there's none. And
The 2 to 1, 3 to 1, it's that kind of people who live with not the level of
with
care
one support
required.
worker.
Yeah, they might still have two to 1 people. Yeah, so that so often I might say something from a housing point of view, but the SIL will say something from a care point of view. So yeah.
1 to 2. When you look at the calculator, it's 1 to 2. 2 to 1. 2 to 1. Sorry, Sarah, is if a participant needs 2 people under the SIL.
Under the SIL.
2 to 1. It's 1 to 2.
Yeah, sorry, it's the other way around. 1 to 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's 1 to 2. But in the SIL, you have issues where the other participant needs 2 to 1 for transferring. So that comes in under the SIL, and that's got to go through the SIL. That's where the roster of care is virtually one of the most important documents now in housing, is to get the roster of care right, so the SIL provider can be covered and supply the staff for whatever hours that the one participant may need 2 people for transfers, but the rest of the time, that time they're 2 to 1, but the rest of those evening hours are 1 to 2. So, and then you've got your overnights and your different hours for rostering, and these guys are sort of been tearing their hair out, because we're going to do SIL differently up here.
So,
they're going to have
am
choices.
I understanding right? So if someone's 1 carer to 2 participants, that's more money return than 1 carer to 3 participants.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm certainly not implying that MiHAVEN.
Sorry, in the SDA.
It depends also, it depends what category they go to too. So improvability is, I don't know.
You just got to work out.
But there's the SDA pricing schedule, and you can just go through that. And there's a Excel sort of model that you can put it in, and because obviously to attract property funds to want to invest in this, they are looking for a return on their investment. And it's a brand new asset class that's been evolved through this scheme across Australia, which is exciting. But then, like anything new, the banks aren't really coming on board at the moment. They see it as high risk. They don't understand how it works. It's like, well, what's the alternate use to this house if the government blows up the NDIS? We know they're not going to blow up the NDIS. It can't. It's legislated. But there's all this, it's very new.
Like you said, you've got to get that number right in
There's
the
a
plan.
lot of issues
What I'm
in
wondering
the last couple of years where
would someone be disadvantaged if they
it
were
hasn't been.
classified as 1 carer to 3
when
as
they
opposed
really
to
need
1 to 2?
It's fair to be
Would
accepted for
someone
1
1
to
to
2.
2 is going to get a spot over someone that's classified as 1 to 3?
if the house is ready, depending on
It depends, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, so then there's a balancing act for us as a developer, because the cost of land has cost so much, and we can only get so much on, some developers might try and put the carer upstairs because they think, oh, well, then I can get more bedrooms downstairs and do that. Well, we know that's not practical. Why would you do that? I mean, that's just squeezing the envelope. So,
Corporators hate it.
yeah, because you've got to keep going down.
As one of the planners, the head planners did, it's an excellent idea.
Yeah.
And when it
There's an
happens,
emergency
it's gonna be-
Yeah,
downstairs.
but you will see that in plans. You'll see shared bathrooms in plans. So I suppose we've benchmarked a lot of things differently in Cairns as a company. So we do pride ourselves on. It's not all about the money. It's actually about getting the right product on the ground and making sure that house is going to have the best and highest use. 1 to 3, and then we'll have the MTA as well. So we'll be able to sort of.
It's a matter of participants, and because we're different to
Can I mention?
As a company, you guys will need to be auditing all of the NDIS regulations, etc. But when a house is SDA approved, is it approved for a particular period of time
So it's reviewed every year. So it's a huge process to get approved. So you go through your building. If you ever build a home, you get a building certifier signs off at the end. But in addition to that, you have to have an SDA certifier. So they have to be two completely separate companies. They can't be the same. So up until recently, we didn't have that expertise because you couldn't have the expertise because there was no houses here to certify. So we have been working with some Melbourne companies because they've been doing it for 5 years, and because of COVID, we had to do the whole thing through Zoom. But finally, a company here has finally got through their SDA certification at the moment. They'll piggyback with another company for us. So James, from a Rachel's perspective or Amy's perspective, they will look at this through another lens, basically, in the certification to what the building certifier is looking at.
Sure, it's a crossover from the Building Code of Australia to the NDIS design guidelines. And in some instances, the SDA design guidelines overrides the building code, but the building code always overrides the SDA, and there's a lot of confusion about that. For instance, in the building code is the accessibility standard called 1428.1 and .2, which gives you the outline of how a disabled bathroom should be set up. And there's quite strict guidelines of how it should be set up. Whereas in the SDA design, it says backrests and handrails shall not, and shower seats shall not be put in. So under the SDA guidelines, I'm not allowed to fit a shower seat or a backrest on a toilet. Whereas the building surveyor comes in and says, well, you've got no backrest, you've got no shower seat, therefore I can't give you a certification. So I've then got to go to the access consultant, and they've got to write a Bible about why we don't want a shower seat and a backrest. You know, to an OT, it's quite obvious why they don't. But so I've got to spend $2,000 to get an access consultant to write an 80-page document to say why we can bypass 1428 in the building code. So there's all those sort of anomalies that will sort out over time, I think. You know, we can't keep going on giving people $2,000 to write a performance criteria basis on something.
And I think where